Why do you want to be executed?
I have to be. Because I will kill again.
When a normal prison is not enough, the sickest individuals are sent to one place. The last place they will ever see. Death Row.
My role mainly is to make sure he is dead, make sure things have gone appropriately, that things were not unusual.
Today, we look at some of the inmates that have graced the walls of Death Row.
All the men here committing crimes so terrible, the state has decided they need to die.
These are the worst of the worst and have been known around the world for their crimes.
Aren't you afraid?
No, I know where I'm going. I'm going to be with the Lord.
Do you want to die? You want to?
Oh man, if I was to leave this planet, it wouldn't be no big deal to me, because this is a wicked, wicked world. Wicked world.
But what you might not know is just what happened during these prisoners' last brutal days before Death Row. Condemned Row, better known to you and me as Death Row. Here, prisoners live a life of complete solitude, waiting for their final day.
They're handcuffed, made to back out of their cells. Even their showers are individual cells themselves. Death Row inmates are never allowed to be in contact with other inmates.
Only the most violent and deadly inmates are housed here, making Death Row one of the most dangerous places to work.
You just have to have an open eye, be very observant when working in Death Row.
Some have been known to spend years, even decades, waiting for an execution date, often due to the appeals prisoners will attempt through the judicial system. In one of the loneliest places you can imagine, there is plenty of time for these killers to think about the consequences of their actions until they are taken to a final holding cell where their fate is finally sealed.
This exact cell here is where they bring condemned prisoners 30 days before they're actually executed. Why do they use this cell? Because it's equipped with these cameras, and they can watch them 24 hours a day.
Often their crimes are so disturbing that many celebrate the day they are deprived of their lives, usually by the electric chair or lethal injection.
An unprecedented crowd of hundreds started gathering before dawn. It took on a macabre circus-like atmosphere.
Those celebrations were for the first killer on this list, and maybe one of the most sadistic of all, Ted Bundy.
His eyes looked like he was almost a child, and his mother caught him doing something wrong. It was a combination of just being sorry and knowing that it was the end. It was the end of the line.
As notorious as he was famous, Ted Bundy was responsible for hurting and taking the lives of at least 28 women between 1974 and 1978. The youngest victim was only 12. His reign of terror stretched across the United States, committing his crimes in 6 states from Oregon to Colorado. His story became so public that the entire nation was gripped with fear.
Till the very last moment, no one could be sure Bundy didn't have a last trick up his sleeve, a legal technicality.
From a young age, Bundy seemed to lead an apparently normal childhood, with good grades at school and healthy relationships in his personal life. Underneath the surface, Bundy was a psychopath waiting to strike. Although we know of the 28 victims he confessed to, it's believed he could have taken hundreds of lives in his thirst for death. He would defend himself in a very public trial, and in the end would receive 3 death sentences over 2 separate trials. It was while he was waiting on death row that he decided to tell the whole world what he had done.
Well, listen, I've been kept in isolation for 6 months. I've been kept away from the press. I've been buried by you. You've been talking for 6 months. I think it's my turn now. All right?
While appealing his crimes, Bundy went on a spree of television interviews, showing the true nature behind this evil, unforgiving monster. One of the most famous of these appearances is with psychologist James Dobson. He showed no remorse for his actions, only thinking of himself.
What's going through my mind right now is to use the minutes and hours that I have left as fruitfully as possible and see what happens.
He even tries to blame the adult movie industry for his actions.
This kind of literature contributed and helped mold and shape the kinds of violent behavior.
It fueled your fantasies.
Well, in the beginning it fuels this kind of thought process.
And then calmly, he describes the thought process that led him to become a cold-blooded murderer.
I couldn't control it anymore, that these barriers that I had learned as a child, that had been instilled in me, were not enough to hold me back with respect to seeking out and harming someone.
January 24th, 1989, Bundy's final day. He was unable to eat his final meal of steak and eggs. He is believed to have made a phone call to his family before being led to the final room he would ever step foot in again.
One of the more bizarre chapters in recent American criminal history has come to an end.
The scenes outside the prison when Ted Bundy was finally executed were like nothing that had ever been seen before, as a large crowd gathered.
The hearse carrying Bundy moved from the prison past a group of cheering spectators who had waited for Bundy to die, and some said Bundy should have suffered more than he did.
Ted Bundy is dead. But this would not be the first time a serial killer's execution was celebrated, as our next case shows. John Wayne Gacy, often referred to as the Killer Clown, stands out as one of the most infamous and horrifying serial killers in American history. Born in 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, Gacy led a double life that helped hide his depraved acts. At first glance, Gacy appeared to be an average, even charismatic member of his community. He was a successful businessman, known for entertaining children at local events dressed as a clown, which later became a nightmarish irony. However, behind what appeared to be a very normal suburban life lurked a predator who would ultimately claim the lives of at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy would lure his victims, often vulnerable young individuals, with promises of jobs or money. He would then hurt them and take their lives in a brutal fashion. The true extent of what he had done came to light in 1978 when the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peist led to a police investigation that uncovered the gruesome truth. The search of Gacy's home revealed horrifying evidence of his crimes, the remains of numerous victims buried beneath his house.
His murder spree was first discovered on a cold December day when the first of his victims were found in the crawl space beneath his home. They were taken out one by one as the world watched.
The chilling details and the sheer number of victims shocked the nation and sent the media into a frenzy. This was, at the time, the highest number of victims for a single killer. Following a high-profile trial in 1980, Gacy was convicted of his heinous crimes and sentenced to death. It was on death row that his behavior became even more unusual. He began to paint, but these pictures were disturbing images of clowns and skulls, among other less sinister paintings. Some of them were even sold at auction, which seems a little unnerving considering the reputation of the artist. As well as taking up art, Gacy also took up studying law, and his idea was to appeal his death sentence all by himself. But it was a futile attempt at freedom, as he was eventually given an execution date of May 1994. Before his death, he would give a series of bizarre interviews.
Go ahead and kill me, but vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, because you will have executed somebody that didn't commit the crime.
Despite being convicted 13 years earlier, he now denied any involvement in the crimes.
When they paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies, I said, this is ludicrous.
He even made the most ridiculous claims to back up his story.
I've taken 3.5 hours of truth serum, and under sodium amytal, the maximum amount that I could have, it shows that I have no knowledge of the crime whatsoever.
Needless to say, evidence of these sessions where he took truth serum is nowhere to be found. His final day was spent with his family and eating his last meal of fried chicken and fresh strawberries. As he was being prepared for his death, a crowd gathered outside the prison, patiently waiting for the news they had come for.
Kill that clown! Kill that clown! Kill that clown!
Death penalty demonstrators at the prison who favored the execution far outnumbered the candle-carrying death penalty opponents.
Protests or no protests, John Wayne Gacy could not escape the inevitable.
John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m.
The killer's last words were defiant to the end, as he is reported to have looked over a prison guard and then uttered, "Kiss my ass." His behavior toward the guard in his final moments was nothing compared to what our next inmate said about her prison guards. Eileen Wuornos was a troubled woman who became one of the most infamous female serial killers in America.
And he said I did the most horrendous crime in the whole wide world.
She was abandoned when she was very young and sent to live with her grandparents. And at an early age, she began to sell her body in exchange for money and narcotics. Is it possible that her difficult home life led her to commit such terrifying crimes?
Abandoned by her teenage mother when she was just 6 months old, Lee was raised by her alcoholic grandmother and a cruel grandfather who regularly beat her with his belt buckle.
She was arrested several times between the ages of 14 and 22 for various crimes including robbery, but that was nothing compared to what she did between 1989 and 1990. Just like she did as a younger child, she went to selling her body on the streets. Only this time her customers would become victims of a disturbing scheme that Wuornos had begun.
The killings all began like this. A middle-aged man pulled over to pick up Lee Wuornos.
Armed with a gun, she would lure the men into an isolated spot, each victim assuming they would be receiving her services. Instead, the victims would find themselves on the wrong end of the gun and facing certain death. She would be arrested in Florida and charged with taking the lives of 6 men. This would lead to an explosive trial where Wuornos would play the victim and try to escape justice. She would claim the men had hurt her and she was acting in self-defense, but the jury saw through her lies.
We're sitting on the floor watching TV, and she just come out and said, "I have something to tell you." And I asked her what, and she said that she had killed a man that day.
In February 1993, she was sentenced to 6 life sentences.
If anyone was destined to end up here on death row, it was probably Lee Wuornos. Psychologists sketch a portrait of a damaged person with a lurid history of abuse that began in childhood.
And it was while she was on death row that she began to make some wild claims.
I never hated men, but now I do. I mean, not all. I have a category. I hate those male. God. I hate those male cops. Real bad, because they're dirtballs. The cops, the judges, the lawyers, they're all male.
In 2002, she tried to convince the world that she was finding dirt, saliva, and other body fluids inside her food, which she claims could only have come from the prison guards. She claimed the guards were trying to get her to take her own life, something she had tried in the past during her most challenging times. She also made constant complaints about her living conditions, which may have been an attempt to get herself off of death row, or at least buy herself some sympathy. Unfortunately, nobody was buying her wild claims. In a last-ditch effort, she gave several television interviews, and these interviews gave a glimpse into the mind of a sadistic killer.
That's why I don't care if I'm executed and leave this planet.
Her final sentence was carried out on October 9th, 2002, when she was given a dose of lethal injection. Many death row prisoners protest their eventual sentence, but this next killer could not wait to die. Gary Gilmore led a life of crime from an early age, being arrested at only 14 years old in 1964 and sentenced to 15 years in prison for armed robbery and assault. He was paroled in 1976, and from there, looked like he was on course to lead a normal life, taking jobs where he could. But as often happens, this criminal found himself reverting to his old ways, and just a few months after his parole, he would upgrade his status from thief to murderer. Gilmore walked into a gas station in Utah, and he was armed and dangerous. Robbing the store, he then fatally wounded the gas station employee before fleeing the scene.
8-year-old Max Jensen was killed by Gilmore in 1976 at a service station in Orem.
But he hadn't finished there, and the next day he robbed a motel, again firing at an employee, Ben Bushnell. This time there was a witness, Bushnell's wife. Even worse, Gilmore accidentally fired at himself in the hand while trying to hide the murder weapon, an injury that would eventually lead to his arrest. Gilmore had taken his truck to be repaired just before he robbed the motel and opened fire on Bushnell. When he went to collect his car the next day, the garage owner saw the damage to Gilmore's hand and alerted the police. But his arrest was down to his own cousin, Brenda, who Gilmore had turned to for help. She alerted the police, who arrested Gilmore a short time later. His trial in 1976 concluded in only 2 days. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. It was Gilmore's response that shocked the entire world.
From the outset, Gilmore wanted to be executed and chose the firing squad instead of hanging.
Not only did he not appeal his sentence, which is unusual in and of itself, he also asked his own mother and legal team not to appeal either.
I simply accepted a sentence that was given to me. I've accepted sentences all my life.
He would even start a hunger protest when his execution was delayed several times. But this was still not enough, and in desperation, Gilmore attempted to take his own life twice.
National and international media converged at the Utah State Prison. Protesters held vigils.
January 17th, 1997, and Gilmore would get his wish. He had chosen death by firing squad, and as they strapped him to the chair, he uttered some of the most famous last words ever, as he simply said, "Let's do it." Which brings us to our most evil killer today, and one who claimed he would continue to take lives if he was ever released. Wesley Allen Dodd's criminal life began at only 13 years old. His crimes were amongst some of the worst. He would engage in a spree of attacks on children who he hurt for his own pleasure. He would often offer to babysit for various parents, and when he had their children, he would enact his sordid fantasies.
I said there's times I think about what I've done. I think about some of the things the boys said before they died, and that's real hard to think about.
Even the pleas of his victims could not stop this monster. Over a decade, he would hurt at least 50 children, and was only caught when a kidnapping went wrong and he was arrested by the police.
And I've been molesting kids nonstop since I was 13 years old, over half my life.
During the investigation, Dodd confessed to the killing of 3 boys, and in his house was plenty of evidence to send this man to death row.
I can guarantee I'd do it again, and sooner or later I would kill another child. I've done it before, and at the time I liked it.
He had kept underwear and other items of clothing from his victims, and even kept a detailed log of what he had done to each victim. He was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted kidnapping, and was sentenced to death in 1990. While waiting for his final day, he granted several interviews, and what he said during those interviews is truly shocking. On January 5th, 1993, Dodd took his final breath in the gallows.
I know that's the only way I can guarantee I'm not going to hurt anybody else.
Each of these sick and twisted individuals received the penalty they deserved, but it is how these killers acted after they were convicted that shows us the true effects that sitting on death row can have on the human mind.
Other news tonight, in less than 48 hours, local death row inmate John Henry Ramirez will be executed by the state.
I'm in the artery, I hit in the neck, I hit in the groin, I hit in the lung.
8-year-old Vicki Lynn Huskinson disappeared while out riding her bike one day in September of 1984.
Only the most brutal of people have ever faced the ultimate price for their heinous actions. Many spend years waiting for their final day, and as always, they are given a final request that the prison system will honor whenever possible. But some requests are strange. Some are even confusing, where others are completely sick and twisted. Today, we look at some of death row inmates' unimaginable last requests. One of the most chilling last requests of any prisoner came from John Henry Ramirez. His request was so unusual that it became part of a legal battle, where Ramirez would take on the prison system to get his own way.
37-year-old was sentenced to death in 2008 for the fatal stabbing of Pablo Castro, a 45-year-old convenience store clerk, during a 2004 robbery spree in Corpus Christi.
All of this started over $1.25. When 45-year-old hardworking father Pablo Castro was taking out the trash during a shift, he could have no idea the danger that was heading his way. He was an employee of a convenience store in Corpus Christi, Texas. In 2004, Ramirez was on day 3 of a narcotics binge with 2 other women, Cristina Chavez and Angela Rodriguez, when the 3 decided they needed more money to continue.
We were smoking, we were smoking pain, we were taking mainly Xanax, but we had like Valiums and hydrocodones, and then we were drinking vodka too.
Ramirez was no stranger to trouble, with a list of convictions already on his record. They had committed several robberies during their binge, only this time Ramirez would take things too far. The 3 pulled up to the convenience store, and seeing Castro, they decided to act. Ramirez jumped from the van armed with a sharp instrument, which he used on Castro, inflicting life-threatening injuries from which he did not survive.
Castro immediately, leaving behind 9 children and 14 grandchildren.
He then emptied Castro's pockets and made a getaway in the van. Ramirez did all of that for the $1.25 Castro was carrying at the time. The same night, Chavez and Rodriguez were arrested, but Ramirez managed to flee and evaded capture for the next 3 years. He was finally caught on the border of Mexico in 2007 and would stand trial in 2008. He and his 2 accomplices were found guilty, and they would face heavy prison time for their heinous actions.
It took us less than an hour to come to a decision about whether he was guilty or not. There was no doubt about his guilt.
Chavez was sent down for 25 years, and Rodriguez was given 99 years. As the man who took Castro's life, Ramirez would pay the ultimate price, his very own life. What followed would send the legal system into a meltdown, as one man took on the entire prison system in order to get his last request. While serving his sentence, Ramirez became close to his pastor, Dana Moore, of the Second Baptist Church in Corpus Christi. But Moore could have no idea that he would become an integral part of the final moments of John Henry Ramirez's life. Over the next several years, Ramirez managed to delay his final and ultimate sentence, first by requesting a new lawyer, and secondly, by using the pandemic to his advantage. Eventually, his final day was set for September 21st, 2001, and after all the delays, you'd think he'd have used up all his chances, right? Well, Ramirez had one more trick up his sleeve. For his last request, he asked for Pastor Moore to be present at his final moments. But this wasn't to watch from the sidelines. He wanted the pastor to hold his hand on his chest and pray for him during his last breaths. Naturally, the state refused his request, so Ramirez filed a lawsuit to counter the state, and a messy battle would begin. Ramirez would claim the refusal contravened his right to freedom of religion, and their decision was nothing more than religious discrimination. The courts agreed.
It was back in March when the U.S. Supreme Court granted Ramirez's request for his pastor to place his hands on him and pray aloud during his execution.
On October 5th, 2022, Ramirez is administered the dose of chemicals that will put him to sleep forever. As promised, Pastor Moore was there, and 15 years after this sick and twisted criminal took the life of an innocent convenience store clerk, he finally paid the ultimate price. As Pastor Moore said a prayer, it was reported that Ramirez took 2 short breaths, then began snoring until finally the life drained from him. Pablo Castro's son, Aaron, was only 14 years old at the time and had plenty to say about the long, drawn-out process. This is a $2.3 million process. Let's get it on. Stop costing the people money, stop costing the family heartache, and let's get him that sentence that 94th District Judge Bobby Galvin handed down to him. Ramirez may have been able to drag out his case for as long as possible, but he could not escape his inevitable fate. But next, we take a look at a man who made the strangest request ever. Trinity County, Texas was not the type of place that experienced the kind of tragedy that would take place on October 9th, 1984. So notorious was this day that locals who were not even born when it happened talk about this infamous, brutal accident. When the police arrived on the scene, they discovered 3 family members, Gene Hathorn Sr., his wife, Linda Hathorn, and their teenage son, Marcus Hathorn, had lost their lives by horrific means. The area was littered with clues, and police were quick to act. But they would soon learn this evidence was not all it appeared to be. They found human hairs and cigarette butts at the scene, but they failed to nail a main suspect after a month. Then they came up with a lead that would point the finger of blame a little closer to home. There had been arguments about money between Gene Hathorn Jr. and his father, and officers started to believe the family had been taken out over money. The father had recently come into possession of $150,000, and it was starting to look like Hathorn Jr. had his eyes on the wealth, whatever the cost. With his father out of the way, Hathorn Jr. would inherit that money, or so he thought. It turns out his efforts were in vain, as he had already been written out of his family's will just 3 weeks before. Hathorn Jr., his accomplice, James Lee Beathard, became friends after working in a psychiatric hospital, and when Hathorn Jr. told of his desire to take his stepfather's life and his money, Beathard decided to get in on the act. But when this case hit trial, the 2 friends turned on each other, and the blame game would begin. Beathard would face the courtroom first, and the star witness against him, none other than Hathorn Jr. His testimony was devastating, and he pinned the whole world, or at least the worst of it, on Beathard. According to Hathorn Jr., his accomplice took the lives of 3 family members and planted the false evidence. Beathard was given the ultimate sentence. He would pay with his life. That's when Hathorn Jr. went into his own trial. The district attorney accused him of being the main man responsible and believed he had committed the perfect crime. And the jury believed him, sentencing him to the same fate as Beathard. Beathard spent the next decade protesting his innocence, but would finish his appeals and pay the ultimate price on December 9, 1999. Hathorn's case would be a little more complicated. He would appeal in 2009 based on his trial attorney's failure to introduce evidence of his childhood trauma he had been through. But after he failed his appeal, he had an unusual request that would literally turn him into fish food. It was all part of an art exhibition where the ground remains of his body would be used to feed the fish in an art piece that was symbolic of prisoners' last days on Earth. The request was never realized, as he actually won his appeal and is now serving consecutive life sentences, reportedly working as a prison cook in the general population. Although this next final request would not be as grotesque as being turned into fish food, it would certainly leave many unnerved, as one prisoner wanted to ensure he had the last laugh. Monday, September 17th, 1984 was the very first day Carlson Hoskinson had allowed any of her children to go out on their own. She had asked 8-year-old daughter Vicky Hoskinson to mail a birthday card to her aunt. Vicky was a bright and popular young girl and only too happy to help her mother, so she grabbed her bicycle and started the short journey to the mailbox. After 20 minutes, her mother became concerned, and she anxiously let Vicky's 11-year-old sister, Stephanie, go out to look for her. Then, the nightmare for this family began.
We just will look forward to the day to where we get to be reunited with her.
Stephanie found her sister's bicycle lying by the side of the road only a few blocks away from their home, and everyone assumed the worst. Thankfully, one man had seen suspicious activity at the time and did what any good citizen would do. Sam Hall was the coach at Vicky's school, and when he saw a man making odd gestures in a vehicle near the school, he decided to note down the license plate just in case. Another girl had seen a man driving past her house, and he made a rude gesture towards her, and a third witness saw the same car driving into a telephone pole. As soon as Hall heard Vicky was missing, he contacted police and passed on the most crucial lead the police could have gotten. The owner of the car was 28-year-old Frank Atwood, who already had a disturbing criminal record involving crimes against children.
Witnesses place Atwood, a convicted child molester who was on parole at the time, in that very neighborhood.
The car was registered to his parents, who were shocked when the FBI turned up on their doorstep looking for their son. Within hours, Atwood came home complaining his car had broken down, and he needed them to wire him some money to pay for it to get fixed. His parents then passed on the address in Kerrville, Texas to the FBI, and they drove out to apprehend their suspect. When they arrived at the mechanic's shop, they found Atwood and his traveling companion, James McDonald, and detained them both. It had been 10 days since Vicky's disappearance before Atwood was caught, so the interrogation was crucial. Atwood did not deny being in the area of the disappearance. In fact, he told them he was staying at a nearby park. At 3 p.m. that day, he left to buy narcotics and returned at 5 p.m. This placed him firmly in the right neighborhood at the right time, and he had a 2-hour window that just so happened to coincide with the time Vicky disappeared. McDonald confirmed Atwood's story, but also gave the officers some disturbing new information. He claimed the two had an argument, and then Atwood had left the park, only to return at 5 p.m. But when he did return, his hands and his clothing were red-stained. When McDonald asked him what had happened, he said he had been in a fight with a narcotics dealer, and the narcotics dealer had come off worse. There was no physical evidence inside Atwood's car that would link him to Vicky's disappearance. But the outside of the car was a different story altogether, where crucial evidence could be hiding just out of view.
The vehicle, a 280Z Datsun, missing its front bumper, which sits in court evidence.
On closer inspection, they found exactly what they needed.
This is what Frank Atwood's car looked like back in 1987. Now fast forward to several decades later, the car still stands in evidence.
Paint on the bumper of his car matched paint from Vicky's bicycle, and using expert forensics, the prosecution were able to determine that he knocked her off the bicycle before scooping her up into his car. On December 3rd, 1984, Atwood pleaded not guilty to taking Vicky Hoskinson and would wait almost 2 years before his trial would begin. Sadly, there is no happy ending to Vicky's story, as on April 12, 1985, a walker discovered her remains on the Sonoran Desert near Tucson, about 20 miles from where she went missing. Atwood's trial in January 1987 lasted almost 2 months, but ultimately he was found guilty as charged and sentenced to pay the ultimate price. His final day was set, June 8, 2022.
It'll just be a beginning of a different chapter, and it will not be with him there. No more. And we're looking forward to that, because if you think about it, I'm 67 years old, and most of my life has been around this case.
His final request was both bizarre and sickening. He had been given a choice between lethal injection or lethal gas. He wanted gas, but not the kind they would normally use. Atwood requested that they use nitrogen gas, or laughing gas as it is known. Imagine how you might feel being the family of Vicky Hoskinson, watching as the man who took your daughter's life was laughing to his last breath. As you might expect, the state refused to accommodate Atwood's request, so he was given an injection and lost his life on the scheduled date of June 8, 2022. Vicky's mother had plenty to say when the date was announced.
My first reaction was, hallelujah, finally.
This was the last family photo taken with Vicky in it. Throughout the years, her family has carried her memory and the grief with them, waiting to see the conclusion of this case.
But if that request is bizarre, this next final request is downright eerie. Tommy Douglas Arthur, also known as Tommy Arthur, is one of the sickest men on this list, and is the one with the sickest final request. On the morning of February 1st, 1982, police responded to a disturbance at the home of Judy and Troy Wicker in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Once they got inside, they were greeted with a scene of pure horror. Troy Wicker had lost his life in his bed with massive injuries to his head. Judy was found alive on the floor in the bathroom, and her sister, Teresa Rowland, was kneeling beside her. Judy told officers that after she had dropped her kids off at school, she had returned home with Rowland to find a strange man in her house who physically hurt her before taking the life of Troy and then fleeing the scene. An investigation led to the arrest of Judy Wicker, who was accused of ending Troy's life in order to cash in his insurance. She would face a trial where she was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. After her conviction, she came forward with crucial evidence that would blow this case wide open. She claimed there was another suspect and he was responsible for pulling the trigger that fatal day. For her testimony, she would try and bargain for an early release. So who was the mysterious male caught in the middle of this? Tommy Arthur was staying at the Decatur Work Release Center at the time of the crime. When Judy told police of his involvement, he was arrested. A second trial over the death of Troy Wicker would begin, where she would be giving evidence against Arthur. Judy would claim that she and Arthur had known each other since they were young, and together they had planned to take out Troy. But they weren't alone. Remember the third person at the scene, Teresa Rowland? Well, she also became involved. Judy claimed that she, Rowland, and Arthur had all hatched a plan to eliminate Troy Wicker as early as 1981.
Juries at 3 trials convicted Arthur on charges that Wicker's wife hired him to kill Wicker. Arthur has denied killing Wicker over the past 3 decades, maintaining his innocence.
How did Rowland get roped into all this? Well, she had asked Arthur to commit arson on her own home so she could collect the insurance payments. The plan was concocted after Judy told the pair she was being hurt by Troy. It was around this time that Judy and Arthur began a relationship, and suddenly their plan to get Troy out of the picture was becoming a thing of reality. Judy testified that she knew the incident was going to happen and met Rowland and Arthur on February 1st, 1981, before going on to Judy and Troy's house. From here, Judy attempted to play the victim, claiming she asked Arthur not to go through with it, something he ignored. But she did admit that she paid Rowland and Arthur a large sum of money out of the insurance money she had collected. In this second explosive trial, Tommy Arthur was found guilty of taking Troy's life and was sentenced to pay the ultimate price. But it would take a very long time for his final day to come, as over the next 4 decades he escaped his fate no less than 7 times, earning him the nickname Houdini, after the famous magician. But when his last day on Earth was set for May 2017, Arthur requested he be allowed to choose how his life ended, and he chose the firing squad. He had his reasons, claiming that injection would be extremely painful due to a back injury he had developed while incarcerated.
Now, the U.S. 11th Circuit Court of Appeals denied a last-minute request to stay his execution after he challenged the state's lethal injection drug and procedures for administering it. Arthur denies his involvement in Wicker's killing.
On May 26, 2017, he finally faced his fate and fell asleep for the last time after a dose of life-ending serum was administered. Next, one prisoner requested a last meal that contains a stomach-churning main course. Born in 1952, Smith was working as a cab driver in Houston, Texas, when he fell in with the wrong crowd and began committing petty theft. But petty theft would become a whole lot more on the day of March 7th, 1983. 44-year-old Larry Don Ruos was the company district manager for the Union National Life Insurance Company in Houston, Texas. He was a hard-working family man and well-liked by his employees. He was with one of those employees that fateful day when Smith approached the counter. He produced a weapon and threatened the teller, ordering her to hand over all the cash she had. The teller refused and then hid behind the counter, leaving Don Rose staring down a potentially trigger-happy and dangerous individual. Don Rose complied with Smith's request and filled a plastic bag with all the cash he could. Then the situation turned sinister as Smith threatened Don Rose. The district manager pleaded for his life, even taking off his expensive gold bracelet to offer. Smith pulled the trigger and left him with life-threatening injuries. 2 office workers had seen the whole thing and began pursuit of the suspect into a nearby apartment complex where they ducked for cover as Smith fired at them several times. It was when Smith left the complex and tripped on the street that several brave onlookers apprehended him and waited for law enforcement to arrive. Don Rose was rushed to the hospital, but despite the efforts of the medical team, he sadly lost his life. Smith was charged with taking his life and would face a courtroom to answer for his crime. However, during the jury selection process, Smooth managed to break loose and escape the courthouse. But it appears escape is not something Smith can get right, as once again he was apprehended, and this time there would be no escape. The trial shocked the local community, and with all the evidence pointing right at Smith, he was found guilty as charged on April 5th, 1984. Naturally, he appealed the decision, but his appeal was thrown out by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and his final day was set for May 11th, 1988. When the day finally came, Smith managed to win a reprieve. His mother's attorneys asked the Supreme Court of the United States to spare his life, based on the ground that Smith was mentally incompetent, and amazingly, the Court of Appeal agreed to hear her case. But if Smith thought that this would be his ticket to freedom, he was totally wrong. The appeal was quashed, and once again, his final day was set, this time for June 26, 1990. Smith refused any more appeals, and another by his mother's attorney was refused at hearing, meaning Smith would face the final consequences for his brutal actions. Just like every other person in this case today, Smith made a final request. He would ask for one thing only: a plate of dirt for his last meal. This wasn't any dirt, this was Ray Kunda dirt. It was used during voodoo rituals, and he had planned to eat every grain. It might come as no surprise that the state did not grant his request, so instead he chose to eat a yogurt before being led into the chamber where he would spend his final moments of life. It is reported he claimed innocence right until his very last breath, but with so much evidence against him, it's clear that this is one man who deserved everything he got.
So I went up to him. Do you want to stand up? No. Yes. Went up to him. Stood over like that. I did first there. I've done it a few times. While I was doing that, my voices were laughing and laughing and laughing louder and louder.
Snapchat is not very smart. How many people in the owner house, not in the car stop? Because of that Snapchat thing you did. It's all over, you're all over the internet network. Social media. It's on social media. If I come stay with me after they come this. Just for your well safety.
I've never even heard of something so horrific as this. It's just, it shocks the mind, shocks the soul.
Every child makes a mistake from time to time. It's a part of learning and growing up. But normally those mistakes are pretty simple when you're a child. Maybe you stole a candy bar from a convenience store or cheated on a spelling test. Rarely do children do things so horrible that they are considered hardened criminals. Even more rarely does a child make a mistake so evil that it could end up landing them on death row. The following are stories of some of the most deadly children to either end up in this position or get terrifyingly close to it.
It's to death.
Because of your youth, though, you also have no concept of death.
A 19-year-old from Warren County, now the youngest person on death row in Ohio.
The idea that he has no worth or value as a human being, so better off euthanized.
For the brutal murder of a friend.
On January 28, 2014, two 19-year-old men named Austin Gregory Myers and Timothy E. Mosley brutally took the life of 18-year-old Justin Michael Back in Warren County, Ohio. Their motive? They wanted to steal a safe that was in the Back family home, and Justin was merely standing in their way. Justin was not a stranger to these teens. In fact, Timothy had attended school with Justin for years and considered him during childhood to be a good friend. But somewhere after his graduation from high school, Timothy's loyalties to Justin must have changed. Austin reportedly approached Timothy and asked him if he was interested in making some extra cash. But they weren't going to be getting this cash through a side job. They were going to steal it. They considered two options. They could rob a local drug dealer, or they could attempt to steal the money from Justin's stepfather, Mark Cates. They knew that Mark had a significant amount of money locked in his safe, and they came up with an elaborate plan to break in and steal it. It wasn't going to be enough for them to just break in and steal the money. They wanted to cover up their tracks as well. So they decided that they would kill Justin, cover up the mess, remove his body, and then take the safe. This way, they could make it look as if Justin was the one who had stolen from his stepfather and then make a run for it. They waited until they knew that Justin was the only one home. They then knocked at the door. Justin, who suspected nothing of their visit, let them into the home. They all chatted for a while, until Timothy eventually saw an opportunity to ambush Justin from behind. Meanwhile, Austin helped tackle him to the ground. He then reached for the sharp object he brought as a weapon and used it to brutally kill the teenager. Once Justin was dead, the teens made their priorities clear. They went through the house and stole what they could, including the safe and some jewelry. They also took some of Justin's clothes to make it look like he had packed to run away. It wasn't until after they had already finished with this that they worked on cleaning up the scene of the crime. They loaded Justin's body into one of their vehicles and then used ammonia to clean up the mess inside the house before fleeing the scene. After they had disposed of Justin's body in a remote area, the teens were eager to check their loot. But much to their disappointment, when they were able to break the safe open, there was no cash in it at all. Only some of Mark's paperwork was inside. The teens burned everything they couldn't use and returned home. When Justin's stepfather returned home later that day and realized that several of his belongings were missing, he called law enforcement. But when they arrived at the scene, they quickly began to suspect that something much more serious than a teen swiping some things and running away had happened. Security footage revealed that there was a strange car parked outside of the home around the time the robbery had likely taken place. That vehicle was traced back to Austin Myers. Both he and Timothy Mosley were later brought into the headquarters for questioning. Justin's body was found not long after. Both of the teens tried a variety of different made-up stories, each trying to pin the killing on the other. Ultimately, they were both charged and convicted for killing Justin. Timothy was able to land a plea deal that landed him life in prison without parole, but Austin was not so lucky.
Two families in court, one to see justice carried out for their son's death,
the other one to beg for their son's life to be spared.
Justin's mother addressed her son's killer in court.
Austin could have stopped it, but tells Justin it's okay, it's almost over. You could have changed your mind many times, but you didn't. Especially when Justin was begging for his life.
Austin was sentenced to death. He remains on death row, awaiting execution as of September 2023. There are certain countries that take illegal substances a lot more seriously than others. In the United States, if you're caught with a hardcore illegal substance, you're likely to be going to do some jail time. But the death penalty certainly wouldn't be on the table for this alone. But in other countries like Bali, they are less forgiving. 19-year-old Manuela Vitiora de Arajo Farias was caught trying to smuggle 7 pounds of an illegal substance. This Brazilian woman's motive is not like anything you would expect. She was reportedly desperate when she agreed to work with a gang to obtain the illegal substance. The gang allegedly told her about a Buddhist temple where you can go and pray to ask for healing. Because Manuela's mother had recently suffered a stroke, she believed that if she could get access to this temple, she would be able to help heal her mother. But her efforts almost cost her her life. Bali does not mess around with crimes like these, and Manuela is expected to be sentenced to death. But instead, officials decided that she would be sentenced to a long time behind bars instead. It will likely be at least 12 years, but her next trial date is still upcoming. Muirhata Quiarsis is a South Arabian activist. He was just 13 years old when he was accused of being part of a terror organization. Despite his young age, he was arrested and placed in solitary confinement, where he was said to have been held for years. The government has expressed their intention to execute him. Muirhata is sadly not the only young boy who has faced death due to an anti-government protest in Saudi Arabia. In fact, he lost his own brother during one of the protests.
The Shia community was protesting against discrimination and incitement against them. What happened in Qatif has led to several boys being sentenced to death, including teenager Mutaja Kueris. The charges against him date back to this night in November 2011.
Officials say that Muirhata, even at a young age, suffered tremendously at the hands of his own government. When he wasn't locked up in solitary confinement, he often faced torture. He was even forced to sign a confession that would lead to his death sentence. His current fate is not known by the public. It's hard to imagine being just a kid and having as little regard for human life as this next teenage killer.
Investigators say Conrad Schaefer was only 15 years old when he and a group of his friends
Up more than a dozen houses in Osceola County. They say he also killed 2 men before being arrested and charged with first-degree murder.
Conrad Schaefer and his friends went out for a fun night in Osceola County, Florida. Unfortunately, their idea of a fun night involved going on a killing spree, targeting random innocent people whom they had never met. They even ended up taking the lives of 2 people who were both very young. One victim was David Guerrero, who was just 17 years old. He had been getting ready to catch the bus to take him to work. The other victim was 22-year-old Eric Rupinar, who had just been minding his own business when his life was brutally stolen from him. The community was in terror for nearly 2 weeks, as nobody knew who could have been behind these senseless killings. It wasn't until Conrad was finally identified as one of the potential suspects that the case took a turn. He was arrested and charged in connection to both killings. He ended up getting a plea deal and pled guilty.
The family members of the victims are glad he's pleaded guilty, and they're hoping to move forward now.
15 years old. I mean, that's the thing that's hard to wrap your head around. Is this was a 15-year-old who was out, with a semi-automatic rifle, shooting up Osceola County.
Despite taking the lives of 2 people, Conrad was not an adult at the time that this happened, so he could not be sentenced to death. He was, however, sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. He will likely be at least in his 40s when and if he is released from prison. This possibility will depend largely on his behavior behind bars and whether or not a court can be convinced that he has been rehabilitated.
Tonight, a Dothan woman is accused of a crime so horrific, veteran law enforcement officers say it shocked even them. A mother charged with murdering her own baby, placing it alive inside a trash compactor before it was later found dead in a landfill.
This is a crime almost too cruel and disturbing to think about because it was committed against an innocent and defenseless baby. Jakayla Williams, an 18-year-old from Alabama, didn't tell her family that she was pregnant. In fact, they didn't even know she had given birth until 10 days after the fact. But what they were told at the time was not the truth. Jakayla was reportedly alone on August 13th, 2023, when she gave birth to a baby boy in her bedroom. She later told her family that she had dropped the child off at a local hospital. Her concerned family members went with her to the hospital because they wanted to retrieve the newborn. But when they got there, they were told that no baby had been dropped off. When it was determined that she had lied about where she had brought the baby, law enforcement was brought in to question her. At this point, she was looking more suspicious than ever. Eventually, she admitted that she had never dropped the baby at any hospital. Rather, she had thrown the newborn in the trash. When investigators got to the trash compactor, they were able to find the remains of the child who had tragically been killed. The newborn had been wrapped up and placed into a zipped bag. The sight was so awful that it took a mental toll on those working at the scene. Police Chief Will Benny gave his thoughts on the matter.
I've never even heard of something so horrific as this. It's just, it shocks the mind, shocks the soul.
Jakayla reportedly did this because she believed the child would be too expensive to raise. Perhaps one of the most tragic aspects of this story is that it could have been handled so much differently. There was no need for the child to die.
She knew, obviously, that she could take a child, newborn, to the hospital and drop it off. And there's Alabama law that there's no questions asked policy.
Jakayla has been charged with capital murder in this case because she has confessed to throwing the baby in the trash and is of legal age. She could be facing the death penalty for what she did to her child. The prosecutor in this case said this when he was asked if trying to sentence the teen to death is something he has considered.
That's something that we have not even discussed. That'll be a decision that's made down the road.
For now, as of September 2023, Jakayla remains in jail with no bond. It will likely be a while still before she learns her fate. Do you think that the state should pursue the death penalty in this horrific case, or should she get life in prison without parole instead? Let us know what you think in the comments below. It was May 7th, 2019, and the school day was going on as normal at a suburban high school in Colorado. That was until 18-year-old Devin Erickson burst into the school looking to kill as many people as he could. He was not alone in his efforts. He was not alone. He had a co-conspirator named Alex McKinney. Alec would later tell law enforcement that Devin had been planning the attack for a while. He had planned to target people who made fun of Alec specifically because he was transgender. Both Alec and Devin entered separate doors on this tragic day and ambushed their classmates who were watching a movie to celebrate the school year coming close to an end. Luckily, there was a hero on this particular occasion who managed to keep things from going from horrible to even more tragic. His name was 18-year-old Kendrick Castillo. He managed to pin Devin against the wall to keep him from harming his classmates, but in the process, Kendrick was sadly killed, dying a hero. 2 other students were also shot as they worked with Kendrick to take down Devin, but they both survived their injuries. Both Alec and Devin were stopped, and there are no more innocent victims who lost their lives that day. While in court, Alec testified against Devin.
What did you see him doing with the gun?
I saw him waving it back and forth.
When you say waving it back and forth, is that like waving it back and forth like you're waving at somebody, or is he panning around the room aiming at students?
From what I saw, he was panning out around the room aiming at students.
Alec received life in prison with the possibility of parole. While in court, he became emotional and offered a warning to others out there who might be considering carrying out similar evil acts in their own school.
To anyone who is thinking of committing a school shooting, get help now. The amount of pain it causes to anyone who ever cared about you, to the innocent people. Don't be a coward and hide behind a gun. Be brave and learn how to get help.
Because Devin was 18 years old at the time of the killing, he would face a much harsher sentence.
This evening, the young man who killed Kendrick Castillo and injured 8 others was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Devin Erickson was convicted in June on 46 charges, including Kendrick Castillo's murder.
Kendrick's father addressed the media following the sentences. He spoke of the pain his family is feeling, even though they are so proud of what their son did through his courageous actions. Others also share the way this tragedy affected their lives forever.
My wife and I will never have closure. We'll never find peace.
As one by one, families affected by the Stem Highlands Ranch school shooting spoke about how their lives have changed since that day.
I wanted to be able to face Alec the best I could and explain what he's done to our family.
Snapchat, it's not very smart. Now we have people on the phone in our house, not in our cars now. Because of that Snapchat thing you did. It's all over, you're all over the internet neighborhood. Social media. It's on social media. Your body comes stable when you have to get done with this. Just for your well safe being.
It's one thing to kill someone and just hope that you'll get away with it, but it's another thing to kill someone, joke about it on social media, and then still expect to get away scot-free. That's exactly what 14-year-old Aiden Fucci did in the spring of 2021. Aiden, intent on killing someone, got the number of 13-year-old Tristan Bailey. He then convinced her to leave her home and meet him at a friend's house. He then lured her away to a secluded area where he used a sharp object to attack her more than 100 times. He then fled the scene, leaving her behind. Once Tristan's parents reported her as missing, it didn't take long for an interesting security footage to be brought to the attention of law enforcement.
Newly released video by prosecutors shows what they say are the last moments of local teenager Tristan Bailey's life. Investigators say this is 13-year-old Tristan walking with her accused killer, 14-year-old Aiden Fucci.
Not long after, Aiden and a friend of his were picked up by law enforcement so that they could be brought in for questioning. While in the back of the official's vehicle, they posted a Snapchat in which they smiled at the camera and seemed to be poking fun at the entire situation.
Having fun in a cop car. Yep.
Aiden's parents were brought into the station to speak with him. They were clearly distressed and trying to impress upon their son just how bad this was looking for him.
This is very serious. This isn't a joke. This is your whole life. Your whole life. And hers. And hers. And your brothers and sisters. And not for the kid in this world. because the kids were working.
On Mother's Day, May 9th, 2021, Tristan's body was located, and her heartbroken family members were notified. Aiden was arrested and charged with her death. In court, the judge informed a stone-faced looking Aiden as to just how much trouble he was in.
So let me tell you what you are charged with. You have been indicted by the St. Johns County Grand Jury on the charge of first-degree premeditated murder. That is a capital felony. That is normally punishable by up to death or life imprisonment. In your case, because you are not yet 18 years old, death is not a possible sentence pursuant to the Florida and United States Supreme Courts, but this charge does carry a maximum penalty of life imprisonment.
So, because Aiden was not an adult, he could not be sentenced to death. He was, however, facing the duration of his days behind bars. He ended up pleading guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life behind bars. He called the killing a heinous, atrocious, and cruel, and noted that Aiden had no respect for life. Crystal Lane Smith, Aiden's mom, was also charged in connection to the case because she tried to keep her son out of trouble by washing his clothing that had Tristan's blood on it. She pled no contest to tampering with evidence and was sentenced to 30 days in prison and 5 years of probation. She has since been released.
Some of the voices were talking to me. You need to make a sacrifice, or we're going to come and get you. You need to do it. And I saw him. It was laying on the grass. So I felt like that. It was like just fast asleep. Where he was drunk. And he goes, "He's the one. He's the one. He's the one. Do it, do it."
This is the story of James Fairweather of Essex, who was just 15 years old when he took a life for the first time. The first occurrence on March 29th, 2014. The victim was a special needs 33-year-old man named James Atfield, who had suffered a brain injury while in a bad car accident. The victim had been drinking on the day he was killed. He then lay down to rest on the grass. When Fairweather spotted him, he ended up approaching him with a deadly weapon, which he used to kill him. When paramedics arrived at the scene, there was nothing they could do to save the man's life. Fairweather had already fled the scene. While it appeared that Fairweather had gotten away with this killing, he still wasn't satisfied. It would only be a few months until he would take yet another life. This time, the victim was a 31-year-old student named Nahid Almina. She had been walking on a trail close to her home when Fairweather ambushed her with a sharp object and killed her. One of the places he wounded her was her eyes. He would later say he did this so she could not see the evil. Law enforcement initially had very little to go off of. They interviewed person after person, including Fairweather. However, he provided an alibi, and they didn't suspect him at the time. It wasn't until over a year later that law enforcement would actually arrest him. Surprisingly, at the time, it wasn't because they suspected him to be connected to the killings. Rather, he was displaying odd psychotic behavior. The teenager was found loitering in town while brandishing a weapon. Believing him to be a danger, officials took him into custody. Through questioning, they would discover he had some very dark and scary thoughts, as well as an obsession with serial killers. He would later be charged with the killings, as well as for carrying an illegal weapon. He said that he was innocent and claimed to be psychotic. In a bizarre and very spooky interview, he described the day when he said voices in his head told him to kill his first victim.
So I went up to him. Can I stand up? No. Yes. Went up to him. Stood over like that. I did him first there. I've done it a few times. While I was doing that, my voices were laughing and laughing and laughing louder and louder.
In April 2016, Fairweather was ultimately found guilty by a jury and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 27 years. He tried to appeal the sentence, but was denied by a judge. Some think that Fairweather should have received a death sentence for what he did to these innocent people. Do you believe that he received a just sentence? Let us know in the comments.
Happy Teacher Appreciation Week, Mrs. Graver. Thank you for all that you do in and out of the classroom. We really appreciate how much fun we have in your class and how much Spanish we learn. And we just hope you have a really good day. Gracias.
The sweet message of appreciation that you just heard was a message that a grateful high school student recorded for her Spanish teacher, 66-year-old Nohema Graber. Nohema was a well-loved student at Fairfield High School from Iowa. Nohema was originally from Mexico, but came to the United States with her husband and worked as a teacher for many years. Despite being known as a hardworking and kind teacher who cared about her students, Nohema unfortunately found herself as the target of two sadistic and cruel teenage boys who wanted revenge after receiving a poor grade from her. 16-year-old Willard Miller and 16-year-old Jeremy Goodale came up with the heartless plan to take Nohema's life for no apparent reason other than they didn't like her. The teens learned the woman's routine and found out that she would often take a stroll in the park by herself every evening. They then used this information to their sick advantage. On November 3rd, 2021, Nohema set out to take her walk like she always did, but this time she would not return home. As it started to get late, her family became increasingly worried about her. They ended up calling law enforcement and reported her as missing. Tragically, her body would be discovered not long after. The teens had used a bat to brutally take the life of the 66-year-old woman, who was no match for them. They then used a wheelbarrow to transport her body, which they later hid under a tarp. She had suffered severe injuries to the head. Just 2 days after Nohema's body was discovered, both Willard and Jeremy were arrested. This was after they were spotted by a passerby near the scene of the crime on the night it occurred. Nohema's van was also seen leaving the area while being driven by two young men. Willard later pled guilty to his role in the killing. Meanwhile, Jeremy tried to pin everything on his accomplice, but noted that he was aware of Willard's plan to kill their teacher. Because neither teenager was of adult age at the time the brutal killing occurred, they could not be sentenced to death, though many people believed they deserved it. It was determined that they would, however, be tried as adults. Prior to his sentencing, Willard addressed the court. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, he took responsibility for what he did and apologized to the victim's family for the harm he caused. Tragically, Paul Graber, Nohema's husband, passed away before he could see justice served for his wife.
I'd like to take this opportunity to wholeheartedly accept responsibility for the role that I've played in the murder of Nohema Graber. I would like to apologize for my actions, first and foremost, to the family. I'm sincerely sorry for the distress that I've caused you and the devastation I've caused the family. All my heart and heart. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry to hear about Paul Graber.
Despite the horrible things he did, Willard appeared very unemotional as he went on to address other parties that he had hurt through his actions. This included the members of Nohema's church, with whom she was very involved. It also included his own family members.
I'd like to apologize to my family. I love you guys so much, and I'm really sorry for what I've done. And I'm planning on getting back out there as soon as I can and make up for the lost time. I'd also like to apologize to the Goodale family. I'm sorry for the position that Jerry's in.
Willard Miller received life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. It wasn't what his lawyer had been hoping for, as he wanted Willard to serve time in the juvenile system instead.
Miller's attorney said his chances at rehabilitation were better in the juvenile system, but the judge said there just isn't enough time to fulfill rehabilitation from such a magnitude of a crime before he ages out of the system at age 18. He's 17 now.
Meanwhile, Jeremy Goodale is expected to be sentenced in November 2023. Do you believe both boys should face the same sentence in this case? Let us know in the comments. Most teenagers would not even dare to think of committing the crimes that those in these stories carried out. It's almost hard to wrap your head around this kind of evil, especially when it was being carried out by just a child. But one thing is for certain, each of these teenagers changed their lives in a moment when they made these tragic decisions. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next video.